Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spikes. I'm delighted to be joined today by GB News national reporter Charlie Peters. Charlie, welcome.
Fraser, thanks for having me.
Charlie, you have been looking into the issue of grooming gangs for several years now, and it has blown up in quite a spectacular way over the past week. We'll get into a bit more of the detail and a bit more of the history and things like that in a bit. But first of all, just as we're recording this, there's been a House of Commons vote. Parliament has voted against holding a national inquiry into grooming gangs. Labour MPs were whipped into opposing a Conservative amendment. Charlie, what's the rationale for opposing an inquiry? Surely it's a good thing to have more information uncovered about this issue.
Well, first off, Fraser, this decision was made about 5 minutes ago, and since then, my phone has exploded with, quite frankly, rage and confusion from survivors who've had to relive a lot of horrible experiences in the week of conversation that's flowed since this scandal broke again into the national conversation. But they're now seeing people voting against a full inquiry into this atrocity. I'm going to read through these messages later, but they are very severe from survivors across the country, many of them in towns where there's been no inquiry. There's been none at all. So why might they have done it? 364 MPs voting against, only 111 voting in favour. I don't think that includes every single Conservative, if we include all 5 Reform MPs. So not everyone in the opposition there on the Tory benches voting for this. Why might they have done it? Well, fundamentally, the Casey review into Rotherham in 2015 exposed that some Labour politicians had been involved in the cover-up of the abuse. Labour has rarely come out in the positive side of tackling the grooming gang scandal in particular. I think quite seriously that many MPs in these constituencies where these abuse gangs have operated are quite nervous about what might happen in those constituencies should an investigation go through. Now, Labour's official line is that the reason why we don't need an inquiry is because we've already had one. They say that the 2022 J report, the ICSA inquiry into child sexual abuse, that's enough. However, we've shown in our analysis and in our investigations that it barely looked at this issue. It barely looked at on-street grooming. It was a small subsection of a sub-report within ICSA on organised networks. It looked at just 6 areas where it found grooming gangs, but there were no major incidents within those spaces. It looked at Warwickshire, Fraser, but it didn't look at a single one of the northern towns where this has been going on for decades. Not a single one. Warwickshire, but not Rochdale. Warwickshire, but not Bradford. Now, I am thinking that a lot of Conservatives are quite embarrassed by this as well, because it shows that during that period that Baroness J was looking into this investigation, they completely lost sight of it. They let that inquiry fail to stay on its mission to look into grooming gangs as one of its subsections. If you were serious about doing that, as Alexis J says the report was, you wouldn't have gone to Warwickshire as one of your 6 places. You would have gone to the many different towns and cities where this has been going on for years. At GB News, we found up to 50 different towns and cities with credible reports of these grooming gangs taking place, but for some reason, they didn't look there. So that's the Labour cover, that's what they say, but I have to say that for the first time now, it does feel as though a tide has turned, and that cover is falling away. It's falling away. And it all started because last Wednesday we revealed that Jess Phillips, the safeguarding minister, had blocked an independent inquiry into the grooming gang scandal in Oldham. Now, the reason why they don't want that independent inquiry is because they say, the local report does enough. But survivors in that town have told GB News that they don't trust the council to mark its own homework. They don't think that the most recent review was good enough. Jess Phillips last night admitted she's yet to speak to a single grooming gang survivor from Oldham. How can she know that it's okay to have a local review when she hasn't spoken to them and heard their concerns? She took nearly 4 months to respond to that letter. She's answered a lot of questions about Elon Musk, but nobody has been able to ask her, or nobody has asked her, why she took 4 months to respond to that letter. I have to say, she did a lot of interviews last night. She did not choose to speak to GB News.
And also, there seems to be that Keir Starmer tried to suggest that anyone pushing for an inquiry was jumping on a far-right bandwagon. What's been the reaction to comments like that to the people you've been speaking to?
Yeah, this story's had so much going on in the last 7 days that a quote like that from the Prime Minister should be one of the first things you mention, but there's so much that I didn't even include that in the first response. The reaction to that has been severe and stern, as most of the reactions have been to most of the statements from politicians on this issue over the years. But that really flicked a switch inside a lot of people to think you can't tarnish concerns into this issue as far right, precisely because, as he should know, Keir Starmer should know, one of the main problems with this scandal over the years, over the decades, frankly, is that false accusations of racism, being politically extreme, being part of the far right, led to that cover-up, led to concerns, quite legitimate concerns, that people weren't doing anything because they didn't want to be called a far-right racist. I reckon quite a few very serious voices, very respectable voices, people who want to speak out, good, honest, normal people, would have been additionally cautious because they heard the Prime Minister, by any measure of any imagination, a leader in this country, the political leader of this nation, say that some voices were jumping on the bandwagon spread by the poison of the far right. I mean, what can you say? What can you say? It's just an extraordinary thing to say. And Labour have sought to clarify that he was talking about politicians jumping on a bandwagon, not ordinary people. But lots of ordinary people support that call coming from various politicians, not all from the party, they're not all Tories, lots of Reform MPs, lots of MPs in the past have made this request. So, yeah, I think ordinary people and survivors and campaigners and whistleblowers, yeah, will have been very upset by that line. And I've heard that many times since he said it on Monday.
And let's take a step back and consider this scandal more broadly. Can you give people who, perhaps if they're new to this, I'm sure people will at least be aware of it, but maybe not entirely across the details. Can you give us a sense of the scale of the scandal? How many potential victims are we talking about? What are we really talking about here?
Well, Fraser, I won't be able to give them the full scale of the scandal because MPs have just voted down a national public inquiry into the issue, which is a great travesty. It's a great shame. But what we know so far is that there have been some local reports into this crisis in a few towns. In Rotherham in South Yorkshire, Rochdale, Greater Manchester, and Telford in West Mercia, just near the border in Wales, for those watching overseas who don't know where West Mercia is, quite understandably. They found thousands of victims in just a handful of towns. In Rotherham, 1,400 victims at a conservative estimate from 1997 to 2013, raped by predominantly Pakistani gangs. Oldham, they're still trying to work out how many survivors there. Rochdale, hundreds. In Telford, 1,000 at least over decades. And in all of those towns, they found an issue with predominantly Pakistani men being behind this abuse. They're called grooming-gangs, and I think that that's a legitimate term because the grooming model of exploitation is central to this specific form of on-street group localised child abuse. However, it's not enough. You have to call them grooming gangs, and you also have to call them rape gangs. And in many cases, you have to call them torture gangs. Because what these children endured is nothing short of torture. Children being kept in cages, being anally raped by gangs of men, having the initials of their abusers branded on them with heat on their skin, all right? Kids were murdered by many of the abuse gangs, okay? This is as serious as it gets. But we don't know the full extent of it because there's never been a full national reckoning with this issue. Concerns were first raised by a Labour MP called Anne Cryer in the constituency of Keighley in West Yorkshire in the northwest of England in 2002. She's a Labour MP, part of the party that's just rejected this inquiry. She was derided as a racist by senior officials in her party and told to shut up for the sake of community cohesion. Jack Straw, Labour MP in 2011, he said that Britain had a problem with Pakistani men seeing white girls as easy meat or fresh meat. Again, criticised very severely by Labour for saying so. Sarah Champion in 2018, she was kicked off the Labour front bench because under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, she said that Britain had a problem with Pakistani men abusing white girls. So Labour has often tried to shut down this issue within its own party through its MPs, and we only know about the scandal in Rotherham because of dogged reporting from the Times newspaper. Andrew Norfolk exposed the scandal there, working with the whistleblower called Jane Senior. But that should have sparked far more alarms than it did. We did get a national reaction. The CPS changed their guidance, police changed their guidance, But there are still historical wrongdoings that need to be addressed, accountability for those failures. No police officers have ever been fired over this scandal. Nowhere, ever. Ever. Thousands of kids abused in the most appalling ways, often aided and abetted by police officers. No one fired. No council leaders held to account. Nobody charged with anything. So, yeah, people do feel as though, quite rightly, I think, there's never been a proper national reaction and reckoning with this crisis, because every time it's come into the media, there's been a bit of a conversation, then it disappears. I have to say, though, Fraser, seriously, this time I feel as though that's changed. So long has this conversation been, over 7 days. So powerful, some of the testimony we've heard, more revelations coming up, and also the political damage caused by voting against more investigation. I think that's going to seriously make this return on a regular basis.
Yeah, I did want to ask you a bit more about the institutional response from the police, from the local authorities, from social workers, things like that, because this is the way that the girls were almost victimised again, that they were not just ignored, but treated with contempt in many cases.
Yeah, and disdain. And some of the early reports of the abuse that I've seen from the 1970s, children are referred to as silly girls. And it's not just girls, by the way. Lots of boys were abused in Rotherham as well. That's a core part of the J report, but predominantly it is girls, of course. Yeah, victimised twice is how it's the sort of language you hear from a lot of survivors, to not be believed by anyone they turn to, and it's a sense of relentless helplessness, because all the people in society who should turn and protect you don't. I mean, this morning, I met with a man we know as Jack, who I've known for many years, who was arrested several times by South Yorkshire police because he tried to rescue his daughter from a rape den. It's just the most horrifying state of affairs. To think that the girls were helpless, of course, but even their family couldn't do anything is appalling. In the Rotherham scandal, again, I go back to Rotherham because that's where we have the most information, because it's one of the few places there's been an inquiry. It's one of those few places we've had an investigation in a thorough manner. We know that the head of Children's Services did such a bad job that Children's Services in South Yorkshire, in Rotherham in particular, rehomed a child because the parents in the foster care unit supported UKIP. They did that at the same time that they did not investigate child abuse. I know of a family who had to flee to Spain to escape the gangs from Rotherham. So hopeless was the investigation from local authorities. So, yes, helplessness and being victimised by those who are meant to help you is just, horrendous.
There's been a lot of accusations that the mainstream media haven't done enough on these issues. I mean, on the one hand, I think it's fair to say that people like Andrew Norfolk at the Times, or Julie Bindel, the feminist writer, were there very early on at the start, uncovering these scandals. But isn't it also fair to say that, particularly in the past week or so, perhaps too much of the focus has been on the spats between Elon Musk or the alleged threats directed at Jess Phillips, rather than on the actual scandal itself? Are the mainstream media doing a good enough job at informing the public at the scale of this atrocity?
I've been very surprised by the extent to which the focus has been on Elon Musk and also, frankly, the safeguarding minister, Jess Phillips, but not on the survivors. So many interviews with Labour MPs and ministers has been about, is Musk a threat to democracy and all the rest of it. Nobody's asked, as we revealed last Wednesday, why it took Jess Phillips 4 months to respond to that request from Oldham Council for that survivor demand for an independent inquiry. So look, the media has done great jobs on this national grooming gang scandal on lots of different occasions, particularly, as you mentioned, Andrew Norfolk in Rotherham. They launched their report because they said the Times wouldn't leave them alone. The Sunday Mirror's work in Telford meant that a local inquiry happened there after years of resistance from the politicians there, many of whom have been promoted into higher office since then. But the reason why I made my documentary is to make it a national effort, to join the dots, to look at this issue beyond just a few local investigations, to show this is a nationwide crisis that needs a nationwide response. And I was really surprised that nobody had made that by the time I started doing it. It struck me as such an obvious thing to do. And here's the really shocking thing. I mean, I have some competition on this, right? I mean, Jason Farrell doing great stuff in Hull. Channel 4, Jackie Long did an amazing report from Barrow in Cumbria last month, showing actually CPS failures there. A lot of focus on the policing council, not a lot of focus on prosecutors. That was really great. But I was leaked Jess Phillips's rejection to Oldham well over a month ago. Yeah. I had that letter in early December. I didn't run it until January because I didn't think it was appropriate to do over Christmas. Right? I've been sitting on that story for 5 weeks. I did that because I knew nobody else would break it. Because I knew nobody else was looking there. I knew that I was. There's no better feeling for a journalist to know that you're onto a scoop and nobody else is there. But on this, I'm desperate for more competition. Desperate for more because, first and foremost, it would be good for the survivors who matter the most in this crisis. I'm just a reporter. I haven't got a big team here. There's more I want to do. I'm sitting on stories right now that I know I need to process. I've got right of replies to send. I've got further investigations to do. So I want that. I want more reporters to do that. But I also want more reporters to not contribute to the problem that has covered up this scandal for so long, which is not to sort of do PR for what is frankly a left liberal view on this, which is to deny the reality of the ethnicity-based element of this offending. After our documentary came out in 2023, very soon after, the government took on some of the recommendations we made in that film, which was to launch national investigations led by the National Crime Agency. That made hundreds of arrests in its first year. We revealed in May of last year, the government released, actually, we didn't reveal anything, but nobody else covered it really, that they'd made 550 arrests. They'd protected 4,000 victims. When Stuvella Braverman launched that team, when she launched that task force, and Number 10 went big on the Grooming-gangs crackdown, the main media line on that issue was they're lying about the Grooming-gang scandal. Is it really still going on? Oh, and also Stuvella Braverman is being racist. The political editor of The Guardian, Pippa Crerar, on the day of the Grooming-gang scandal, she put out a tweet saying, oh, here are some facts, actually, about the Grooming-gangs, referring to a Home Office report in 2020 that we've revealed as a total whitewash. It didn't look into the data properly. We've actually done some digging and shown further, more compelling academic research and more recent, up-to-date research. So, yeah, the media has done a lot of great stuff on this, but its framing has often been atrocious, and the level of reporting has not been proportionate to the scandal itself. Quite frankly, British journalists have spent more time talking about George Floyd than they have about Lucy Lowe from Telford or Laura Wilson from Rotherham. And those should be household names, but they're not.
And finally, actually touching on some of the things you've raised there, there's almost a sense, do you worry that there could be an inquiry, or, you know, the government's come up even now with some new proposals to deal with these problems? There will be some technical fixes. There'll be things like mandatory reporting. There'll be certain new safeguarding rules. But the central issue that this case raised, that racial sensitivities were standing in the way of justice, and perhaps also class hatred was standing in the way of justice. Do you feel that those things, are we any closer to overcoming those barriers to solving this problem?
I think we are closer because the conversation that's happened the last week has been so incredible. Like, you've got parliamentarians talking about this so openly in a way that just was never happening before. More and more stories coming to light, I think, and also, you know, just referring back to that 2023 situation with the coverage then, many of the things that GB News was saying then were being dismissed by other broadcasters. They're now not being disputed. You know, just reading the copy from other broadcasters, reading reports, listening to reports on the radio, they're saying things that they told us we couldn't say 2 years ago. The conversation has turned. However, yes, I am concerned that the cover, as it were, referring to the ICSA report and a few recommendations there, is going to be shown to be, oh, we're acting on this. Well, none of those 20 recommendations in the ICSA report are specific about group-localised child sexual exploitation. They're not about grooming gangs. One of those 20 recommendations is for a minister for children. What will that do for sacking police officers who fail? What will that do for accountability? What will that do for deporting foreign nationals who engage in child rape and torture? Nothing. Literally nothing. So those recommendations, as the government say they're doing stuff, many of that stuff is brilliant. I'm glad that our reporting bounced the government into bringing forward its action on child abuse, stuff which is long overdue, like mandatory reporting. but it should also bounce them into acting on group localized child sexual exploitation, specifically on street grooming. So far, they have not done that.
Charlie Peters, thank you very much.
Cheers, Fraser.